I'd like to call this meeting of the Southbridge School Committee to order. We'll go ahead and do roll call. Ms. DeMillo? Here. Ms. Shea?
Present.
Mr. Murch is present. Mr. Thomo?
Present.
Ms. LaPriori?
Present.
And Mr. Messier?
Present.
All right. We'll move on to agenda item number 2, the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. We're going to move on to agenda item number 3, public input. Are there any members of the public that would like to speak at tonight's meeting? Seeing none, we're going to go ahead and move on to agenda item number 4, the receiver's announcements. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Villar.
Well, good evening. It is nice to be here with you this evening. I want to start by welcoming the new members and congratulating you on your appointment. I look forward to working with you in this committee. It was a pleasure. I've met with 2 of the 3 new members and hope to meet with everyone individually at different times throughout the year. I want to frame my comments this evening that I've been pretty vocal in multiple meetings with members of the town council, members of the school committee, that my vision is aligned with the chairmans and many people here in town that part of the role of receivership is to help restore the school committee and create a scenario where the town is ready for home rule of schools. That transition, when it'll happen and how will, I can't read a crystal ball, but it does need to happen. And it's an important part of what we do. So hopefully tonight is us taking a step in that direction, restoring better communication, and I hope the school committee's support of the work that is happening in the public schools. I can share 3.5, almost coming up on 4 years ago, I started here in town, and I'm confident sitting here tonight telling you that the schools are in a better place now than they were when I began, but they're not anywhere near where I know they can be. Certainly dealing with the pandemic has set us back a bit as it challenges everybody in the Commonwealth and really across the globe. But we have made significant strides, and I would point you all to the quarterly report that was emailed and can be re-emailed if folks need another copy, and it is also always on our website, where I shared with the Education and Health Human Services Subcommittee information about the opening of school and progress towards meeting the goals and objectives of the turnaround plan. So that document is available. I would encourage you to take a look at it. I try to highlight for the subcommittee the progress that has been made over the last 3.5 years in significant areas. I'll remind everyone our focus has been working on a positive climate and culture in the schools. I always translate that to happy kids and happy teachers. It's very important that school's an enjoyable event for students. We're also working on numeracy and literacy skills across the district, and we've remained focused on that for the past 3 years. That's critically important for us to build a foundation upon which we can expand into other areas. I hope that working with you, we can begin to advocate for the needs of the school district. I can recall in past councils with different individuals having members of the school committee advocating for 0 school budget increases. That's harmful for the school district. A 0 means a setback. Inflation now is even higher than it was in the past 3 years. But a 0 means cuts, and we certainly can't have that. And so I hope you can be advocates for the school district. Part of the agenda tonight will be talking about changes in budget format that I hope can make it even clearer as to how we're using money so you'll feel better about supporting the budget. I think this committee can also be very helpful in talking about the very positive things that are happening in our schools, the very hard work our teachers are doing, and the impact it's having on kids. Southbridge was one of the few districts in the Commonwealth that remained open for children last year during the pandemic. So we had a good 85% of our kids, if not 90, back to school in our elementary schools by last spring. And we opened school with about a 60-40 split of kids in person. And so what that tells me is the hard work of our teachers and their building principals created an environment where parents had faith, and they knew that the teachers were there for their kids. And I think that did students a great service. And that story needs to be told. That was our teachers, that was our principals, our nurses doing the hard work. And they need recognition for that. So that was a real positive that we take from our pandemic experience. We remain open, we remain in a pandemic. We continue to report cases, but things seem to be, knocking on wood, better than last year at this time. And our educational progress must continue. So we're not stopping. We continue to focus on improving literacy, numeracy, and our climate and culture. But we face challenges. And I hope you'll see that I continue to be transparent about those challenges. One of them I shared with the town council at the subcommittee. We've hired more than 107 staff members this year since July 1. It's not a Southbridge phenomenon anymore. We had been making good progress on teacher retention, but the pandemic has certainly created difficulty for all school districts in retaining and recruiting staff. It's a tough job to begin with, and it's a lot harder now. So we are struggling to make sure that we keep and retain and hire teachers. At this time, we're staffed, but we've also created positions to try to help students who are behind and are struggling to fill new positions. So that will remain a challenge. So I hope your advocacy can help point people to the positive experience of living and working and sending your kids to school in Southbridge. That helps me with recruiting and retaining teachers. Just to point out, I have staff members who now, many staff members in the last 4 years, who have asked for permission to transfer their kids into our schools. They work for us. They're in the building, and they say, Dr. Villar, can I have my student choice into Southbridge? That's a story that needs to be told. Because these are people who are in the school all day long, and they're like, yes, I want my child here. I think that's really positive. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to get out there, because we are fighting a reputation, unfairly earned in most part, but a reputation nevertheless. So I look forward to that partnership. Tonight I've got 2 items that I really want to dive into that I think are super important. And I think over time, we can dive into others. I want to be transparent that my intention is to meet with this group at least quarterly at this point. We can, if we're successful and we find more positive outcomes, we can look to increase it. But I just want to be very clear that's the intention moving in. And again, we can delve into quarterly reports, maybe begin to talk some strategy about how to advocate. I think the budget season is going to be an important time to be talking with this group and explaining our proposals so that, again, we can have strong advocates for the schools. So tonight, I wanted to give you an update on our conversation with EHS. I'm sure some of you watched it. I believe it was recorded on YouTube. But we want to avoid the impasse that started last spring around the budget. Just to remind everybody, what essentially occurred is there's a dispute over the format of the budget. The budget process in a typical district would be school superintendent would bring forth a proposal to the school committee for a budget. The school committee would then really make final decisions on allocations, format, presentation, et cetera, and it becomes the school committee budget. And that budget's then presented to the town council. Of course, here in receivership, it's a little different. The receiver creates and presents the budget to the town council. There were members of the council last spring that didn't like the format, and we're trying to change it. There's fundamental problems with that. The way the law is structured, it's the role of the school committee to create the budget in the budget format. town council has to approve the bottom line. And so that's why you saw tense back and forth conversations about that. But I was not going to cede the authority of the school committee to the town council. Yes, in that moment, I was the school committee. That's how the legislation is written. But moving forward, that will continue to need to be how the district operates. And when I leave and you take over, it'll be your budget. And you certainly don't want a future council telling you how to shape your budget. They can give you the bottom line, but the priorities and how that money's spent is school committee priority. And so that dispute happened last spring, and it wasn't good for any of us because it's a distraction. I was really pleased with the outcome of the EHS meeting, the conversation we had. We talked about the format with members of the council to see what information they would like. This evening we passed out to you a sample of a table that was created based on that conversation. I'll stress multiple times that none of these numbers are real. That this is a fake document. I asked Mr. Racine to pull it together for us. But the idea here was to show and to meet a request that I felt was very reasonable, which is to help show what actual spending was in the fiscal year. So if you look at this document, the example is fiscal year 20, we know the actual. Those numbers are audited, those expenses have been made, that's a real number. And then there's the actual for 21, again, audited, real expenditure data for the district. And then there would be the budget of the current fiscal year that's not audited, so the year we're in right now, as we talk about next year's budget, will not be reviewed, audited, and finalized until next fall. And so there will be projected budget numbers, and then the proposed budget, which is the budget that we will be asking for in the upcoming fiscal year. And then the last column is the variance between this year's budget and the proposed budget. And the concept here was to give school committee members, town council members, community members an idea of, okay, so what did the district spend in these lines for a couple of years? What are they projecting to spend in this year? And what do they expect to expend in the budget that they're asking for approval? I think that this document will be very helpful for those who want to do that type of analysis. And I believe, and the group at EHS seemed to be in consensus that this will move us forward and prevent the disagreement we had last year, which is exactly what we had hoped to meet and to resolve. So we plan on structuring our budget this year using this format, addressing all the content and areas that we've historically shared. So that would mean a heavy focus on where staffing are. We call that full-time equivalent, or FTEs, in each of the buildings, so you'll know where people are, how many people in each building, and then we break down into the cost centers. So that was, I think, a very important step forward at the last EHS meeting. The next part that we talked about at that meeting, which goes along with this budget, where I see a role for the school committee immediately, and it will always be moving forward, and it has been, is a discussion about the capital needs of the schools. So when we say capital needs of schools, we're really talking about the physical plant, right? The buildings. What do we need to do to keep schools functioning, operating at a high level and meeting the educational needs of students? So this evening I've distributed to each of you a report that was commissioned by the previous town manager using a grant, I believe, that he was able to secure back in May 2019. And it took a look at our facilities. And I have increasingly kind of raised the alarm around our facilities over the last few budget cycles, because we have old schools, with the exception of the middle high school. We're not going to go through this book tonight, obviously, but I did want to give it to you so you could take a look at it in your leisure, and again, we'll begin to talk about it. But on page 3, it points out, so central office is in the Southbridge Academy. So that is the old Cold Ave building. We use that for our alternative school, middle and high school. It also provides offices for some staff members in the special education department. It has our Welcome Center, which is our registration center for new families in town. That building was built in 1927 with an addition in 61 and 73. So that building is in massive need of updating if we continue to use it. Eastford Road was built in 1935, updated last in 1993. Now, I remember when 1993 seemed like not that long ago. Unfortunately, it is a long time ago for a school building. That's just how life is, I guess. Charlton Street, 1938, with an update in 93. West Street, 1936, with an update in 1993. The middle high school was built in 2011. And we have the field house listed in the maintenance department, which is that small little fire department you might see in a corner down by West Street. It was 1894. Candidly, I'm less concerned about our maintenance department's office at this point. Very much more concerned about school buildings. The issue, and I've had conversation with the town manager and the chair of EHS and others, is we have 4 buildings that need substantial repair. There are estimates on page 4. These are already 2 years old. Costs have already risen dramatically, and these numbers are going to change. And things have changed in the buildings to some extent. But we're looking at least $26 million in investments just to update buildings. I have Mr. Racine here this evening, largely because I believe there are ways that the town needs to begin to talk about this that make much more financial sense. What we've been doing, in my experience since I arrived, is every year we get between, say, $150,000 and $300,000 in capital money. Prior to this year, half of it was used for computer technology, which I have tried to build into our operating budget moving forward, because I don't really believe leasing Chromebooks is a good use of capital money. I think that's educational supplies, and so we have made that shift in our current budget to make it a sustainable investment for the school district. But the buildings do need repairs, and we've been trying to make repairs at $150,000 a year. Last year alone, a large section of roof ripped off West Street in a windstorm. Right? So there's a major insurance claim repair. The year prior, I believe it was, West Street had the Univent heating systems. They're wall-mounted AC heaters. They vent directly outside of the school. They need to for fresh air. Well, one of those vents stuck open, froze the pipes burst, and I think it was a Monday morning. I don't remember the actual date. But we had a $500,000 insurance claim because water filled half the school from the pipes, flooding. These events are going to continue to happen because these are old school buildings. The systems are antiquated. They will fail. I'm quite candidly concerned what happens if they fail in January and Eastford Road has no heat. That's a problem. What happens if another roof blows off? I've worked in a school district where we had 2 high schools' roofs simultaneously fail in a winter. The same week, heavy snow, quick thaw, both roofs fail, water fills both high schools. That's not something we want to have. So last year in our capital budget request, we suggested a study be done on how to address the engineering needs of the schools en masse so that we can work more frugally, really, to get major fixes done immediately. For example, maybe it's you repair the roofs in all the older schools. The roofs would be eligible for Massachusetts School Building Authority reimbursement. Doors and windows are eligible. There are many pieces. In fact, I'll have Mr. Racine just talk a little bit about that program in a second. We also need to examine building use before we start throwing money at buildings. Look at enrollment and talk about solutions to these problems. Is Cole Ave a building we want to spend money on? Or do we want, and these are just fictitious ideas, there are no plans in place, do we want to combine schools, build a new school, shut down a school, move programs from Cole Ave to the older school, knock down Cole Ave? There's a lot of iterations that can happen. But without experts looking at cost associated with those, we're talking about large sums of money without a plan. And that doesn't make sense to me, for sure. So I'm going to ask Mr. Racine just to talk a little bit about Massachusetts School Building Authority and the role they play and how it might line into the need for us to do some long-term planning.
Thank you, Dr. Villar. Good evening, everyone. My name is Seth Racine. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. In Massachusetts, there are two major funding programs for schools. The first is the Chapter 70 program to support communities with their operating budget, their annual budget that we receive in terms of state aid. The second major funding source is related to the Massachusetts School Building Authority. Massachusetts has said we want our students to attend high-quality facilities, and so we are going to divert a portion of state sales tax to go to the Massachusetts School Building Authority, an organization that reviews applications by school districts and communities for building improvements and major renovations in new buildings. It is an application-based only, so you need to apply. It's not just allocated like Chapter 70 is for the operating budget. But when you apply, you can apply to two different programs. One is major repairs, such as roofs, boilers, windows. The other one is a major renovation or a new school building. They give more funding to communities in greater financial need. And there's an opportunity every year to apply to receive this. It really is an incredible opportunity, but communities need to take advantage of it. And this is a community that could stand to benefit. I can give you one example of another community that's also in receivership that took advantage of the Massachusetts School Building Authority opportunity. And that is the first receivership, the Lawrence Public Schools in Massachusetts. They had a number of crumbling, older, outdated buildings that were very, very old. They went through a master plan process first. That is sort of in the application process of the Massachusetts School Building Authority. It is a kind of like the gold star. They would like to see that you know where you're going as a community with buildings, because one of the things they're going to be asking you, whether it's for the major repairs for new roofs or for a new building or major renovation, is are you going to be there for a long period of time? We're not about to give you millions of dollars and suddenly you say, well, we don't really need the building anymore. So they wanted to make sure that you've done your due diligence. So for the Lawrence Public Schools, they went through the master plan process. And they said, we both have projects that are emergency repairs, and so they replaced their equivalent of 25 Cole Ave that held an alternative school, that held central office at one point. They needed new boilers. They applied for that, and they received substantial funding from Massachusetts School Building Authority to pay for most of that. They also said, as part of their school planning process, their master plan process, that they needed new elementary schools, and they applied for 2 new buildings. And they're currently in the process of building 2 state-of-the-art major elementary schools, including new athletic fields, in Lawrence, where the state is paying for at least 60% of that funding. It's a really incredible opportunity to get brand new buildings paid for by the majority of it to be paid for by the state. That is just an example of one community that did this, but it's another community that is also in receivership that the MSBA provided substantial funding for.
Thank you. And that master plan really, I think, is the point of discussion that needs to continue to happen with Mr. Jovan and the EHS subcommittee about, the town's interest in that. And I see this as a role that the school committee can play. I feel the long-term use of the buildings is a town decision. And I really need town input as to, where Southbridge wants to go with the use of the facilities. I can manage them as they are now, and we can get enrollment projections, and, we try to maximize the use of the facilities. But long-term, it's Southbridge's decision. It's not my decision to determine how you want to use your school buildings and where you want to invest. And so that's why I think that's important. I see that you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I don't know if this is a good time to ask, but I appreciate the fact that you're even here and going through all of this with us, Dr. Villar. One thing that I've been interested in for a while, and I'm wondering if this would be a great opportunity to just say this, because I personally have never even been in the school buildings. And I would love to advocate for something like what you're talking about, where we're trying to encourage the town committee or town council to work on a master plan and all of this, but not even having been in the buildings, it's really hard for me to come behind that as well as I would like to. And so I'm just wondering if it would be possible for us to set up an opportunity for any of us on the school committee that would like to be part of that, to be able to actually tour the facilities and see what exactly we're talking about.
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. In fact, yes, that does happen. I routinely bring members of the council have come with me. Mr. Murch has come on a school tour in the past. So absolutely, we can set that up and have you come. I'm always interested in showing people the good, bad, and the ugly of our schools. I think it shows, the ability to show progress. Like, you just have to be real about things. And there are great days, and there are days where it wasn't as good as we wanted. Not interested in hiding anything in our schools. So absolutely, we'll find a time that works, and we'll bring you in. Typically, it's unannounced. I just show up with guests, and schools roll with it. All right, so again, that to me, I think is a really important step moving forward, is to begin a really thoughtful discussion with town officials about what are we going to do with these buildings. I understand there are a lot of priorities that the town faces, right? So there are the major road projects are underway right now. There's the firehouse that certainly has gotten lots of attention and necessary for sure. Talk about another old municipal building. So those are two major draws. There's also currently we're in the process of Massachusetts increasing requirements on local contributions to schools. And so we talk about this each budget cycle, but there is a steep increase of mandatory local contributions to Chapter 70 that are underway. And the good news coming into it is we were above minimum spending levels as we entered into this 7-year cycle, right, Mr. Racine? So we're a couple of years in, and we have a little cushion as a town. And this is something the town manager and I talk about regularly. Again, Mr. Jovan at EHS, we've talked about this in multiple budget presentations. But in the outer years of this, it goes up pretty steep, which means the town also will need to contribute to the operating budget of schools. So kind of looking at all of this, it's demands that are spread along the town. There's also the whole Casella trash issue and the funding that comes from that all come together. And navigating that, I believe, will require a lot of dialogue, a lot of prioritization, and it's important that everyone's pulling the rope together, because if not, bad things happen. Buildings fail, municipal problems left and right. So trying to be realistic about this, but we have to keep our eyes open and we have to be aware. And so that's why each time we speak, we raise these issues. And again, I think there's a role for our relationship in working on this to meeting those needs. So I didn't want to get into all of this, but certainly touring the buildings is a great step. We can start to set that up for folks based on schedules, not a problem. We could also, if there's specific issues seen here and you just want to put eyes on it to really get a sense for it, we can make that part of the tour too, so you just can see. Because this is a major issue. Certainly, the outcomes of education are far more dependent on the actions of adults, right, for student learning, but the environment does matter. And so if our schools are safe and warm, comfortable, inviting, there's actually some studies that show that in itself will increase outcomes for kids. The other sticky component is the better we do, my team and all of our teachers, in raising outcomes for kids, and if we accomplish revising and renovating some buildings, there are lots of families who choice out right now who might reconsider, or future families will reconsider. So as we do enrollment projections, that will be a tricky piece to think about. We're in a competitive environment. Families can choose. Last year, we had the most choice in than we've had probably in 15 years. Now, that number was like 16 kids, so it's not huge, but it's a huge percentage increase. But we do have a charter school next door, right? So there's competition, and then we have school choice. So all that factors into this. There's just a lot to consider. So I thought tonight would be a good first step. Share this information with you. Certainly, if there are any brief questions, answer those. Share the format of the budget document. I fully intend on bringing to you the budget document so we can talk about that. Again, and I can't ask you to advocate for it if you don't see it and understand it. So we'll do that, and begin this process of trying to work for good outcomes for kids. So that's really what I had prepared, and certainly if there are additional questions, we're happy to answer them at this time.
You said that the mandatory amount that the Southbridge is going to have to kick into the school system. Is there a percentage number, or just every year they just tell you 5 minutes before you have to write the check?
I kind of made a funny smile underneath my mask. You can't see it.
I'll take mine off.
I can hear you. I appreciate the question. Mr. Racine, do you mind just giving a quick rundown of the changes in Chapter 70?
Sure, thank you for the question. So a couple years ago, there was a major education funding bill that was passed called the Student Opportunity Act that set over 7 years to say we want to spend more as a state for students with greater needs, including low-income students, English learners, and students with disabilities. We're going to phase in these increases over 7 years, and they're going to be both funded through state aid and local contributions. In the situation with Southbridge, this past year, we were about $2 million over net school spending. So net school spending is the floor. The minimum amount, I should say, that needs to be spent, and you can't fall below it. Looking ahead to this current school year, that number has dropped to, I want to say, about 1.7 million, and it will depend on what our enrollment is and the information that comes out from the state in January as part of the governor's budget. But that surplus, I should say, of how much this town is spending above net school spending may drop in half for next year, and then that means for the next year we could be at net school spending within 2 years. Again, there's a variety of factors that go into that, including the rate increases at the state level, the enrollment, and how that changes. So if the enrollment goes up, that gap may close faster. So we're going to have to sort of wait and see over the next coming months. But you're going to be hearing about this as you have in the last year or two. You're going to continue to hear about this every year because it could lead to a situation where our funding is determined by the state formula and not by choice with the community. So a community that is at net school spending, there are some of these communities in Massachusetts. When the net school spending number is allocated out, that becomes the budget for a place like Springfield, for a place like Lawrence, for a place like, there are a few other communities around the state. And that determines how much the local contribution needs to be, as well as the state aid.
Yeah, and to the credit of Southbridge, there's still a little bit of a cushion. This community, if you look historically, has contributed to its school budget. So that's good news. The other interesting piece of information, our unofficial October 1 numbers show an increase of students this year, about 42 students. That's good for Chapter 70 funding. It will be one of the factors they look in the budget as it comes up for this cycle.
Okay, so basically you're talking about just a general increase. The way it sounded, it was like the state was going to all of a sudden ask us for a higher percentage. It's still going to be that minimum net school spending, and then whether we do above that spending is our choice, but we have to do the minimum net school spending.
Yeah, I think the way to look at it is the distance between where you currently spend above net school spending is closing very quickly to net school spending because, candidly, over the last 3 years, there hasn't been any increase in local contributions. It's been pass-through money from the state changes in Chapter 70, but not local increases to keep pace, so that's closing the gap. At the same time, the formula that determines the local contribution is more aggressive each year, and so it's requiring more money. So the state's giving more money and they're requiring more money of the local. So that's a steeper curve than it used to be. So it's closing that gap faster than it had been historically. So it's hard to hover, and it creates a scenario for the town manager where it gets to be very difficult because you never want to go below minimum state spending because there are penalties involved. And it's after the fact, in determining all that, to close out a school year, I think the town just closed out in late October for last year.
Yep.
So it's hard for them to know what you're spending this year if you haven't finished last year's books. So it's an area where you definitely don't want to be there. And again, to the credit of Southbridge, we are still above that. I hope we can stay above that and continue to make increased contributions to education.
Anything on the increase in expenditures, just the percentage rise in the economy? I mean, I go to the grocery store and every time I go, it's more expensive.
Well, I'm certainly worried about as we prepare the budget. Fuel oil is a huge one. Our buildings have to stay up to temperature, and fuel oil is rising very quickly. Materials and supplies are more expensive. Everything will be impacted. Salaries have to go up to match all that. So it definitely is going to be tighter and tighter as we create our budget. We are maximizing the COVID-19 relief funds from the federal government to try to meet student needs. So a lot of positions you may see advertised and new, a lot of them are linked to COVID funding to help catch kids up that have, were at home and didn't come to school last year and provide mental health services. And there's a lot of ramifications from the current circumstance. But it's definitely going to be a very complicated few years in budgeting. Definitely.
Mr. Mello, and then Mr. Messier.
Yes, I was just curious. It sounded like, I think last spring, as part of some of the budget talk, as if possibly down the road, if we are no longer considered such an at-risk district or whatever the terminology is at the moment, that perhaps our required amount of spending per student could actually go down. Am I correct in thinking that, or is that not the case?
Mr. Racine, I'll defer to you. I don't see an answer for that.
Yeah, so when we talk about Chapter 70 and net school spending, these are not subject to receivership. It's just part of the community makeup and the state formula that's dictated by Mass General Law, Chapter 70. We do, though, receive a special state grant, and we have for several years, related to receivership. So I think just to make sure I understand your question, if we were to end receivership, that would be the one funding source that could be subject to going away.
So I think in the scenario you posed would be, would your required spending go down?
Right.
And the Chapter 70 formula won't change. The state aid, if receivership ends right now, is $1.2 million. It supports, my salary, the team, like different people that are in the district, and largely consultants and things like software. That funding goes away. And I've talked about this for a few years, we do have to be very cognizant of what I'll refer to as a funding cliff. So new COVID monies, the receiver support funding directly from the department, you always have to make sure that what you put on those budgets are not part of your base, because if the money goes away, you have a funding cliff. Now, how are you going to close that gap? It's not sustainable. So trying to be sure we use those monies to create systems that have good positive outcomes, that support improving teaching, support the changes we need to see in the district, but aren't linked to long-term continuous expenditures. So on the receiver grant, the department is pretty stickler on making sure it's not long-term positions, which makes good sense. Right? You don't want to use them to fund, say, a principal of a school. You will need the principal, and if that's your funding source for it and it goes away, you have a cliff. The same applies to the COVID money that the federal and state governments have provided to school districts. You really have to think about how can you use those monies to hit immediate impact but not create a funding problem later down the road. And so that becomes, again, Seth and I talk a lot about managing these and being sure of where the funding is, where's Chapter 70 going to be, what do we think the town's contribution is going to be, and you kind of have to map that out as I'm also trying to improve the school district, which candidly, resources are really helpful when you're trying to do that. It's not the only thing necessary, but it's helpful for sure.
Mr. Messer, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, so related to what you were just talking about with the superintendent grant that Mr. Racine was talking about, you have a lot of city connections. Is that on that budget?
So City Connects, the seed money for that, we're using COVID funding. The plan, though, is that will be sustainable. Essentially, the major cost of City Connects is having an employee for every school with a social work type background to manage their systems. There is an ongoing licensing cost, but we're talking like $10,000. It's not enough to create a budget crisis, but 6 employees is a big investment. I believe it's a sustainable investment because we're also maintaining somewhat artificially low class size because of the pandemic. We're not increasing. We don't have space in classrooms. And when I say increase, I mean 1 or 2 students, but that across the district could be 1 or 2 positions. And so you look at that as a means of offsetting some of the new positions. I believe, based on the social economic status of almost 80% of our students, the needs I've seen in the town, an investment in a program like City Connects, which is wraparound services, helping solve problems that families and students face in a data-driven manner. It's by Boston College. At some point, we should talk more to you all about that because I think it would be a very interesting topic. It's research proven to make a major difference on outcomes for kids. So that's a good investment if our goal is to try to improve outcomes long-term in the district. So to me, that would be a more important investment long-term than an extra EA here or there. So just looking at what's the impact.
Right.
So we've kind of gamed that out right now. The seed money is COVID.
Okay, and you also introduced a lot of data collection programs, right? So are those also part of the grant, or is that part of your budget as well?
So most of that is built into the base of our budget. So what we've done is upgrade systems. So the student information management system in the district is called Aspen. It's a pretty widely used program across the state. So that's now part of our budget base. I forget already what the older system was, but it was antiquated. And so as we look to make, improvements and outcomes, it's identifying in that budget cycle, how can we afford this? And you build it in. And it's generally pulling an old product, putting a new product in. Sometimes they're cheaper. It really just varies from product to product. But it's more about what's the impact.
Sure. And then I wanted to go back to the master plan you were talking about.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of the process of applying for that grant money and building that master plan, I feel like the enrollment projections would be early on in that, correct?
It's an important part.
So I'm wondering how long that would take to put together, and when, if we're going to start, we're going to do our walkthroughs and start sort of talking to people about the needs of the district. I'm wondering when we could get some rough numbers on projections, or when it would be appropriate to have those types of projections.
Well, Mr. Racine and his firm help us with enrollment projections. We look at it almost annually, so that we have an idea of what to expect in the future. It's a volatile scenario for us because of school choice too. So it's something I'm always concerned about. That's why I mentioned a little while ago, Chapter 70. We're up in our student count. That's good,
Right.
because we're trying to always maximize our state aid. So that's something that we can definitely have produced and continue to, and so we share that data.
Because if that's, I feel like that would be a great thing to have to help us advocate for the needs in the schools. If we can show that we have, our projections look good moving forward, and it looks like we're, gaining some momentum, I feel like that could serve as a catalyst for what we need in those conversations.
Yeah, no, it's an essential part. You have to know what your enrollment at least looks like. And there's different types of models, birth cohort analysis and different things that can help a district determine what you should expect for enrollment in your kindergarten down the road. And part of it is looking at birth rates, part of it's looking at the types of properties. I know this town is working out on some significant housing projects that are going to come in, apartments and such. You hear everyone say, well, that might affect or won't affect. Well, those are really important things to nail down, because generally they do impact schools. Right. There's generally more people, and they generally have kids. Overall in New England, though, there is a general trend of people moving out of New England. Now, the rates in communities all vary, and I know in Connecticut, where I live, last year they actually posted a first increase in like a decade of people moving back, and there's all the speculation. But there's been a trend of declining school enrollment across most of New England. Another reason why doing annual projections is really important. It kind of gives you a good idea. That master plan is also super important.
Okay, Mr. Thomas?
Quick question for Dr. Black. In regards to the school capital needs amount, have you come up for a figure for this year?
So the capital needs of the schools?
Yeah.
What we have done for the past few years is we took the estimates from this book,
Right.
and we broke them down, and we submitted them to the town over a 6-year plan. And I initially decided when this was published, I did that again because I wanted to go on record like we have significant needs. We realize the town is not going to fund $26 million in capital.
Right.
I think there's actually, 6 or 7 million in capital pushing out. There are a lot of long-term projects that we have submitted, and we'll submit again. And each year, you're allocated a few $100,000. We prioritize best we can how to.
Is that what you're looking for this year? A couple of $100,000?
Well, no, again.
We need to have a figure
yeah.
so we could either, be an advocate for it,
Right.
So-
So to be very clear, and Mr. Racine, I'll give you a second, but we've been told, since I've been here, we've been told what our allocation is going to be, essentially. So the town manager would be like, it's going to be about 300,000, submit what you have. I kind of broke the mold when we got this report, and I said, well, that's great, but here's what we actually need. Now, we haven't, obviously, this is not something you fund through just a capital budget. This is too much for that. No town can afford, this now almost 3-year-old report is at $27 million. So obviously, this is a long-term project.
Yeah, and so for example, this report says in the next 2 or 3 years, we should be spending $10 million on new roofs at Eastford Road, Charlton Street, West Street, and 25 Cole Ave. This report says we need to spend over $3 million to replace boilers at those buildings. We need to do masonry repairs for almost $2 million. So we're sort of reaching this moment here that this report highlighted 2 years ago, saying you really need to spend tens of millions of dollars on your buildings to keep them as they are. Or, that's why we're sort of raising this question of like, if you do, we should be thinking, how many buildings do we need? Are these the right buildings to invest tens of millions of dollars? Can we access state aid to help offset this huge need that is coming down the line and that we live with when there are major repair issues that just happen during the year when the roofs start to leak or things like that?
I think when you start coming out with these type of figures that are down the road, but you're coming out with them now, I think that can really panic the taxpayer in town.
It could. You know what also will is if I close
It's
schools.
panicking me already.
And also, if I have to close schools for a month, that's going to panic some people
Right.
too.
Yeah.
So it's an unfortunate reality that this hasn't been paid attention to for a very long time. The buildings, 3 of them were renovated in 1993. That's neat that it was all done at once, but it's really bad because now there's no offset. And so the town managing its debt service, right? You always want to look at what you're borrowing for and you're managing that, right? So I'm certain the town manager is looking at this new firehouse and he's thinking Casella's coming offline, so there goes down revenue, and he's thinking I got to start paying a lot for that new high school because that debt now comes on. And they have to manage those payments within the amount of taxes that you can collect. And that puts the pressure on. That's why it's so important to have these conversations, is to figure out what's the best way to deal with this. Because it might be, hey, you know what, we're going to do a roof, and it's going to be this amount of money. Because we know if we don't do the roof and it leaks, it causes so much more problems. It might be, we're not going to spend a dime on this building because it's ancient, we're going to do this one. That's the conversation I'm trying to promote. I do understand it will make people nervous and upset, but we're at that stage now where I'm negligent if I don't raise the issue that people haven't paid attention to building maintenance. It's really important that we take a look at it.
In the past, when I served on the school committee, many, many years ago, during the 80s, when we'd come forth with a budget to the town, naturally they said, no, you got to cut it. And unfortunately, school committees, even now, the first thing they would cut would be capital improvements.
Yeah, but these,
When the school committee would propose a budget, and the town council would come back to us and say, no, you got to cut. They couldn't tell us where to cut. But where we did cut, where the easiest place to cut, and I'm sure Mrs. Shea remembers this, would be in that part of the budget for capital improvements. And this is what eventually happens.
Well, to make a point as far as what the opportunity that we have here now is, well, we fight back and we say, no, we can't. We're at a critical issue point with the fact that K through 5 in this district is in buildings that were built for World War II. That's a major issue. And now we have to fight. And we're going to have to, it's going to be a battle because we don't have a lot. But over the coming months, we need to figure out what we need to prioritize and go from there.
Well, this is why I asked if he had a set amount for this coming year.
I think what he's trying to, and correct me if
I
I'm
know
wrong,
what you're doing,
is
but it's like a tidal wave coming on.
because that's where we're at. When Taliesin was in 5th grade, when West Street, the pipes burst, and they lost access to the library and some of the tech. So not only did they couldn't go and check out books from the library for a brief period of time, and that's very inhibitive to learning, especially students that are struggling to read, which was one of our major struggle points. You just cut out a library out of an elementary school in this district because we weren't maintaining it, or we weren't getting that capital because it was always cut. Now it's time to go, no, we're not cutting it. We need to fix it. Now it's not on him to give us a number. It's on us to fight for what we actually need to. That's where I think he's trying to get at, because the number's $26 million, which
Right.
will probably be like $34 million 2 years later because inflation's through the roof.
Right. So it was either cutting that part of the budget, or teacher's salary, or teachers, or books, supplies. So that was the easiest route to go.
Well, and I'd just point out that the way the Chapter 70 is now, the capital is not part of that equation, right? So capital investments are a different investment when we present our budget. And the town can't afford to meet all these needs in a single budget cycle for sure. And the other, as we talked on, there are many projects that are eligible for reimbursement from the state. So you would be leaving good money on the table. The fact that we do small repairs every year, even if we're like repairing a couple doors a year, you're paying more for those doors every year than if you had done all of the doors in a school and got, 50, 70, 80% reimbursement. Whatever the reimbursement we qualify for is going to be at least 50%. And so that's good money spent. And so that's why looking at this holistically probably makes a lot more sense. That's why enrollment projections and a master building use plan is really important, identifying which buildings you want to spend money on. And then, town manager Michael just came in, looking at the long-term debt service, what can the town afford to do, and having that plan with the town council is really important. Mr. Jovan and I have talked, at some point this becomes a presentation to EHS and a joint conversation with the council, because the way it all works out, the council is the landlord, we're the tenant. I control the buildings as long as they're used as schools, but if it's a major system failure, I call the town manager and say, we've got no heat, we need new boilers, we need emergency allocation from the town. Oh, it's going to be 200,000 or some crazy number. That's a scenario none of us want, and so we want to kind of plan that out. But that's the easiest way to look at it. The town is a landlord, we're the tenants. We really aren't able to, nor do we have the funding to fix the schools ourselves. The town has to help us with that.
Mr. Messier, and then do you have anything after, if you would like? Go ahead, if you said you have one more question.
I don't have a question. I have kind of a statement to your point about the taxes and the large sum of money that has been spoke of today. I feel like I agree with you, because as a teacher, the savings to save jobs and things like that, and the capital kind of going by the wayside just simply to save jobs. But I feel like what has been presented is not just this huge sum of money that needs to be produced, but I also hear that there is some positivity in the sense that we have options not just for money out of our own pockets and taxpayers, but also other options and opportunities to looking at the state and trying to apply for those things. And so I guess my question is we're in receivership. So what is the process of applying for those things? Who puts together those things? And I asked earlier about the master plan. Where do we get started? Who gets started with the master plan? If we're going to get started on trying to create something and advocate for those things,
Yeah. So I'll start and then I'll pass it to Mr. Racine. But my personal opinion last spring, and it remains the same, is we need to work with the town to engage professionals in helping us do a master plan. So bringing in a professional firm Generally, it's an architectural engineering firm that can look at some of these recommendations and talk about the right staging to go at this work, because some of this work is interrelated, some of this work kicks off code updates. It's super complicated. So it's not like you can say, hey, just go put a new heating unit in Cole Ave. Well, the heating unit that's in Cole Ave is no longer produced. So you can't, and therefore you have to put new ones in, and all of a sudden all the building codes start becoming a problem. So having experts do that work is super important. And then the application process, Mr. Racine can kind of quickly remind us of that.
So every year, applications are due to the MSBA. They open up the application window in January approximately, but you need both approval by a school committee and usually by a town council of voting to say we are interested in moving forward, because they recognize that there needs to be funding associated with this. So the town council usually needs to commit publicly in a meeting to vote to say we are willing to find the money to help fund these projects. So there are applications every year, usually starting in the window from January to April. If you do the emergency repair type projects, we talked about replacing boilers or replacing roofs, those projects can be funded and completed within 2 years. If you're looking at a major renovation of a building or a new building itself, it's worth knowing the process for that is quite cumbersome and long. There's a number of meetings, a number of votes, a number of things that need to happen. It's usually a 10-year process until when you first apply to when you open a building. It's just, again, getting ahead of this, looking ahead and starting early can just help, because these processes are very long and also very costly.
All right. I appreciate everything that's been discussed tonight and reviewing the capital budget. And I encourage the rest of the committee, as the months for the budget come along, that you guys review this, and any questions, feel free to meet with Dr. Villar. And that way we can try to get as much information as possible for us to advocate as best as we can. I'd encourage you to take a tour of the schools. I've been through most of them myself as a parent, but we have great staff and decent facilities that still need severe amount of update. The staff does what they can to keep it nice.
Real quick, when's the next time, Dr. Villar, you'll be here?
Well, I had said it would do quarterly. I think once we have the budget information, we should be back to talk with you all about the budget. So probably New Year, January-ish, we'll be starting that process.
Okay.
So after the holidays?
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate, because by then we'll have some idea of where we're headed with all the finances. And again, I just met today with Mr. Jovan and EHS, and we're trying to make sure we meet with them. So I'm trying to coordinate all of that.
Are we going to be having monthly meetings? Are we going to be
Yes,
meeting when?
Yes, we are going to have a meeting in December. I'm planning on potentially having some more training on budgeting and Chapter 70 more specifically, that I'm trying to get coordinated for the December meeting. I'll have more information once I get more information. Yeah. I've been working it for a little bit.
I just want to express to the receiver that you're welcome to attend any meeting. If you feel like it, let us know, let the chairman know. We'd be glad to.
I totally appreciate it, and again, I think we're off to a good start, so I thank you all for your good questions this evening and your interest in the content.
So I'm moving. Thank you very much, Dr. Villar and Mr. Racine. I look forward to all of us meeting with you guys in the very near future and discussing the capital further, the capital needs further. Moving on to agenda item number 5, Chairpersons announcements. Congratulations and welcome to Mr. Messier, Ms. Lapriori, and Ms. DeMello, because finally sat as a board. I get to welcome all of you to the school committee, and got a lot thrown at you tonight, and it's fantastic, and having you guys on just has already been phenomenal, and I look forward, and I'm sure everybody else does, working with all of you for this coming year, and hopefully for a few more years thereafter. I don't have any other additional announcements other than our next meeting should be scheduled for December 14th. At 7, that would be, yes, it would be December 14th at 7 here in council chambers. And I do, for the committee, do look forward to potentially having somebody from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees coming in to give us an in-depth look at Chapter 70 and how it works, how it started, and where we're at and where we're going, including an in-depth breakdown of the Student Opportunity Act and what those percentage increases for the local contribution are going to look like. So that way we all get a little bit of learning ourselves. So with that, does any member of the committee have anything to say before we adjourn?
Just to thank Dr. Villar once again for meeting with us. And I think I'd probably speak on behalf of all of us in saying that we would like to see you be really, really successful in turning our schools around. And anything that we can do, we would like to do. And I think that would really benefit us in the long run, really benefit our town, really benefit our kids. And we're really just excited to see how this is going to work out. So.
Thank you.
Anything else? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Do I have a second?
Second?
All in favor? This meeting is adjourned.